Now that we've learned something about what NoSQL is all about, we're going to get some practice with it. Over the next few video lectures, we'll be stepping through our project, which ultimately involves creating and populating and querying a database that has to do with the AdventureWorks products and bill of materials that we actually had looked at prior when we did our Python exercises for visualization. And we're also going to create a tree visualization, a D3 tree visualization. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But today we're going to focus on creating a DynamoDB database. In a sense, we're doing the equivalent of a create table statement in SQL. So this, you could consider this to be like the DDL portion of SQL. And then here's this figure right here that I've shown you before. That gives an idea of the steps we're going to be taking. So we're just starting with the very first step, which is to create this database. This database will be stored in the cloud in AWS. It will be a DynamoDB database. A lot of what you learn over doing this exercise will make use of what you've learned about data structures in Python, and in particular dictionaries. So recall this correspondence between a Python dictionary and a JSON object, so we'll be making use of that. We're going to be using Boto 3, which you've been able to install at this point. And so I'm going to pull up the shell here, and I'm going to make both a client and a resource. Most of what we're going to be doing is involving the resources, but the client comes in handy because the client allows us to list the tables that we have in our database, so I'll be using it primarily for that purpose. Let me pull up the Python shell. So here's a Python shell. I'm going to create a client and a resource. First I have to import Boto 3. And now I'm going to create a client. So client, that's the name of my variable, equal Boto3.client, and the particular service that I want is DynamoDB AWS services. And there's a ton of AWS services. Let's look at, let me pull up my AWS console, and here's all of the services that are provided, and we're using a particular database service called DynamoDB. But in principle, you can have clients and resources that give you programmatic access to any of these services. So that's one thing we created as a client. And the other thing I'm going to create is a resource. So resource, that's the name of my variable, equal Boto3.resource. And again, I'm going to want to use the DynamoDB service. And if I wanted to know what is in this variable called client, it's referencing an object, which is the class is botocore.client.dynamodb. So we've got an instance of that class. And if I want to know what resource has, it has an instance of another class. So you can be looking in the documentation. Boto 3 has a good documentation. I think I've got a couple of these up here. Here's a Boto 3 having to do with services. Here's Boto 3 having to do with clients. All of that is through boto3.amazonaws.com. So there's always documentation to look at. So now I have a client and I have a resource. And if you'll recall, we were able to use the client to list the tables. And if I was to say client.list tables, you will see, whoops, I spelled client.list tables lowercase. And you will see that we have no tables. This is the entire response. It's giving us things about what the request was, when we did it, all that kind of stuff. But the really important thing, table names, is an empty list. Well, actually, at the end of this little thing that we do, we're going to have a table. So what you're going to be doing is creating a table for the AdventureWorks BOM. But what I'm going to be doing here is creating a table exactly based on what we see at this link here. So let me go to this link. I'm going to open it up. This is a little tutorial for how to create a DynamoDB table. And the most important thing I'm going to do here, let me first show you what the code has. You can see that they also created a resource. We don't have to worry about setting the region or the endpoint URL because you have that the config and credentials file. And then we're going to use that resource to create the table. So I'm going to basically just copy this code here for creating the table. And I'm going to put it into the shell. And then we'll talk about what this code is doing. So I'm just copying it. I'm going to go back to the Python shell. I'm going to paste it. And the variable in this tutorial was called DynamoDB, which is the resource, what the variable was that they used for the resource. But our variable is called resource. So I'm just going to change this DynamoDB to say resource because that's the variable that is referencing our resource instance that we have. And you got table name movies. I'm going to just leave it at that, movies. And you'll also notice that there's these other properties called key schema and attribute definitions and provision throughput. I'll talk a little bit about that. But if I've done this right, I should be able to create it and I get no error. As a matter of fact, if I want to look at the variable table, it's showing that it is in fact a DynamoDB table. So it's an instance of the DynamoDB.table class, and the name of this table is movies. Now let's take a closer look at the code here. And so there's a create table method of the resource class. And you can see that we've given the name of the table called movies. And this right here, key schema and attribute definitions, is about as much metadata as you're going to have in a DynamoDB create table statement. Let me go back to a previous slide here to show you what I'm talking about. If you recall from the previous lecture, there's this notion of schema on read as opposed to schema on write. In a traditional relational database, we were very explicit in our metadata. We gave all of the fields that are required in the table. We are specifying them ahead of time. We are giving their data types. We're giving whatever domain constraints we might have. All of that sort of thing is done when we create the table in the first place, before we even populate it with data. But recall that in the schema on read approach, which is really a big part of what you're going to see in big data kinds of environments, we're just taking data and we're slapping it into a data lake, and we don't really worry about setting metadata until we're actually going to use it. So the only thing with a DynamoDB database that you have to ahead of time set is what's going to be the key, and the key is basically equivalent to a primary key. It's a unique identifier. And also, what's the data types for the key? So what we're seeing here for this table called movies is that the key includes a field, if you will, an item called year. Not an item, I would call it more of a property called year, and another property called table. And these form the key. And what you're going to do is with your AWS database for the AdventureWorks, you're going to have something similar. You're going to create a table. You'll call it AW product BLM, and your attributes are going to be the product ID and the product name. And the other thing that you need to do with the key is you actually have to explicitly specify the data types of whatever makes up the key. But notice what you don't have to do. You don't have to specify any other field at all. And you can be putting fields into different records, different items, they call it, of a DynamoDB database without having to worry about defining them in the first place. So your task will be to do this, but what I'm going to be showing you is the effect of doing the movie database. Okay, so one last thing that we can do here now that we've created this table is to actually display some information about the table. So I'm going to do something similar to what you see here in this slide, but I'm going to do it for the movie database. We've got our table, and I can look at different pieces of information about the table. So if I want to, I can look at the creation date time. So if I say table creation date time, you can see that when it was created. If I say table name, that's the name of the table. If I want to know how many rows are in the table, I can do this. Table, they're not really called rows, they're called items. Item count. And you can see we don't have any records or items in the table at this point. And we'll look at the attribute definitions. Table, attribute definitions. And you can see what are our attributes. We have one attribute called title, and the data type for that, S, is a string, and another attribute called year, and the data type for that, N, is a number. So you're going to be doing the equivalent of what we just did, but you're going to produce a script file for that. And instead of having a table called movies, you're going to call it AW product BOM. And your key will include product ID and product name, but both of them are going to be strings. So it's virtually the exact same statement, but they're both going to be strings. And you're going to produce a script file for that. That's your first piece of this exercise. And I'm actually going to run my script file for this. I'll flash it up on the screen here. And I will run this. And you can see what it's done is it is creating, I've got the little prompt saying that it created the database, the table, I should say, and we're displaying all of that information that I was showing you, when it was created, how many items it has, what the various aspects of the metadata. If I wanted to see a little bit more information about that, again, here's our resource. It is a service resource. If I look at table, just table, that variable, it's saying that it's a Dynamodb table. Bottom line is the output of your script, when you run this script, should be these things right here. So we'll continue with another lecture having to do with actually manipulating the data next.